Well, good afternoon. Really great to see you all, and I'm delighted to be here with you. We are going to move right in. We know people will be joining for a few minutes, but I want to introduce both of our speakers this afternoon. First, with our staff, we have Adam Jesperson. Many of you have met Adam through these town halls in the last few weeks. And Adam will talk some about the PPP forgiveness process and what we know. But we're going to lead with David Thompson, who is the Vice President of Public Policy for the National Council of Nonprofits. The reason we're leading with David is because everything Adam says is in the context of the most up-to-date information, which is what David has. I was on a call yesterday with David, and the questions just wouldn't stop about the PPP and various aspects of what's happening with public policy. So, knowing that everything is in flux, we have already scheduled another session on next Tuesday related to PPP forgiveness, and because we think things will clarify and be resolved over time. So, we're not going to worry a ton about the clock other than being done on time, but it may be that we have more time with David. It's not split half and half with David and Adam. So we'll just see how that goes. And I really, David is a gift to the entire nonprofit sector. And any credit you have given MNA for our ability to stay on top of what's happening at a federal level really belongs to David and his team at the National Council. And so if you want to say thank you to David, now is a great time to do it. He's been working nonstop on this and is truly our hero. And David, and plus a friend, just a great human being. So David, we're so glad to have you back in Montana, even though it's virtual. Adam, is there anything else we want to say about with introductions?
No, I guess, Liz, just to reiterate what you mentioned, we may go a bit long today, and if you can bear with us, we're just going to try to get through all the material just so you have it. If you can't bear with us, this is recorded and you can watch it afterwards. And like you mentioned, Liz, we are going to come back to this topic probably next week just to make sure everyone feels comfortable and has asked the questions they want to ask about the mechanics of loan forgiveness as we know it today, knowing that it may change by the end of the day tomorrow.
Okay.
Am I on?
David Thompson.
I'm on the air.
You're on the air.
Hey, Dave, I love your show. I disagree with everything that Liz said, because we are a network. First off, what we're going to cover is on the screen there. A lot of material and things have changed since those words were typed onto the screen. Things are actively changing. I was asked yesterday on the call that Liz mentioned, will they ever come back together? Have we already missed the window of opportunity where Republicans and Democrats can agree on something? Well, actually, they came in saying kumbaya today, and now they're going back to rancor and so forth. So it's interspersed that things literally change by the hour on these issues. The reason is no one's ever faced this pandemic. No one's ever faced any crisis of this dimension, even when a politician tries to revert to norm of caustic and nasty and whatever. Their norm is reality keeps setting in. The impact, people, they realize they've got to care about the people they're serving. So your senators, your representative have to care whether they want to or not. I know they do, and I know they've been talking to you regularly and I know they've been reaching out to Liz and the team there at MNA on a regular basis. So that's all good. And the fact that you've established relationships over the years is why they're actually paying attention. So I'm going to say up front that Montana really is a model for the country in a number of ways, and I'll give you actual chapter and verse as we move through. We're going to talk about these. I'm going to start with the sector priorities, because I'm involved with the coalition, all the coalitions in town here in DC, to try to fix some of the laws, improve the laws on the federal response, and then how they how they're being worked through the states, and then talk about the Paycheck Protection Program, and then the upcoming legislation. I'm going to try to do all that with your questions in half an hour. Please don't wait to ask questions. Don't wait for me. Don't wait politely for me to finish and then ask questions. Go ahead and type in your questions, because I've asked Adam to interrupt if there's something timely. I really get tired of hearing me, because I hear me a lot. So an opportunity to respond, I learn from questions. So this is why I took a moment here at the beginning to start. Your questions will make me a better advocate for you and for our network. Next slide, please. Our network is this. If to the extent people think I know what I'm talking about, it's because of this network. You see MNA right there prominently featured. Liz has counterparts all over the country that are almost as smart and almost as active and almost as compassionate and caring as she is, and the state associations are fully engaged. We have the opportunity to get early warnings of what's going on. When you do something right in Montana, you can help your colleagues in Maine and South Carolina and so forth. That is our network. You, as members of MNA, are members of this national network, the largest network of nonprofits across the country. That's awfully nice. It's helpful. It's why we have been and continue to be successful. Next slide, please. You see on the screen there, and I have a copy of that. You see a better version of it. This is called the logo letter. This is something signed currently by 450 state associations. 450 national nonprofits have all signed on to a letter to Congress that lists these 4 priorities. Yo, Congress, as you go forward, improving legislation or enacting legislation that have related to coronavirus, these 4 things have got to be included. And they're all 4 of these things are bipartisan. Access to forgivable loans. That's the Paycheck Protection Program. That's the need for mid-sized loans that I'll talk about. Unemployment insurance fairness for self-insured nonprofits. This is an area where we all wish our states were as foresighted as Montana. Giving incentives. We know that charitable giving is down for a number of reasons, including the 2017 tax law, including the fact that there's a recession going on right now, and the people that used to give to charitable nonprofits are now getting the services from those same nonprofits. This is a hard time. We need to improve giving. And then the emergency funding into the states, nonprofits are on the front lines. I wanted to mention these up front, and I'll come back to them because they're consistent themes that go through what we're doing and I think what you're doing as well. One last moment on that logo page, the team at Montana Nonprofit Association spanked me. They did such a beautiful job. You probably all signed on to the MNA letter to the congressional delegation, reemphasizing these points. It was the most beautiful logo page with all the logos of Montana nonprofits. It was a beautiful thing. I made the mistake of admitting it, and Liz has been lording that over me ever since. So figure I might as well be embarrassed in front of all of you. Next slide, please. Okay, now down to work. Paycheck Protection Program is the main thing I'm going to talk about. There is guidance from the administration, several bits of guidance from the administration. The frequently asked questions, the FAQs, I'm looking over here to see if they've updated it in the last minute or two because they keep doing that. This is not a stunt on my part. They literally change them about every day, adding new ones. What I put on the slide there, and yes, you can add these slides, that's my cheat sheet, so that if you're curious, has the SBA come out with something new, you just go there, you hit refresh, and you'll know everything I know. So I'm giving away a trade secret here. They started with about 10 frequently asked questions on April 2nd, the day before the program rolled out, and they've been adding new answers to questions over time. They still don't have a series of questions answering the important nonprofit questions like, why are you asking us who our owners are? Or what do we do about if we have a government grant that pays a salary? How do we handle that with loan forgiveness and so forth? We haven't gotten straight answers on those yet. Maybe Adam can answer all those when I'm done. They've also issued an interim final rule back in April. That's the one where they invented the requirement that you have to pay. You can only get forgiveness for up to 25% of a loan based on non-payroll expenses. That came out of thin air. They also limited the maturity date. You know, the loans can only be for 2 years. You have to start paying in 6 months. A number of confusing things that I'm about to talk about. And then on Friday at 10:44 p.m., the Friday before a 3-day weekend, they came out with guidance, the interim final rule on the loan forgiveness. Adam is going to talk about that a little bit. I just wanted to point out that was just plain rude to come out at 10:44 p.m. on a Friday before a 3-day weekend. Next slide, please. Oh, on the screen there are analyses, comments that we, National Council of Nonprofits, have put out. You get our newsletter. It comes out every 2 weeks. We flag those in the newsletter, and we're doing more of that. We're doing more of these write-ups, these summaries and analyses of the law and the regulations and so forth. And we feature them in the newsletter. So you don't have to go to our website. You're going to get an update. Whatever's the latest word on the subject comes in a newsletter. And thank you for not unsubscribing. So the state of play, the CARES Act, here are, looks like 7 key details that are of concern or that are constantly questioned. There's 500 or fewer employees. If you have 600 employees, you're not eligible for the CARES Act. If you have, and it's a problem because it's not full-time equivalents. It's if you have 500 part-time and full-time and other. A lot of nonprofits are disqualified. There's the affiliation rule, which has been in the news lately. That was put in there to prevent Planned Parenthood from getting Paycheck Protection Program loans. No one admitted it at the time, but now 170 Republican senators and representatives have said that's why it's in there in a letter. And 30 Democratic senators have said shame for shame. Not in any way talking about Planned Parenthood. I'm talking about there's a provision in the law that's in there to prevent one organization from getting paycheck protection loans, and it could catch up some other, many other nonprofits. The affiliation rule says that if a group of nonprofits are controlled by a national organization, for instance, or you operate regionally and you have local operations, if the home office can control or has the ability to control, then you have to count all of those employees together. It's again in there for one organization. It's under attack, and I bring it up now just mainly because it's the big sticking point on any efforts to increase Paycheck Protection Program to apply to nonprofits that have more than 500 employees. It's a sorry state that all nonprofits are swept up into this issue. There has been a lot of effort to expand the Paycheck Protection Program to employers larger than 500. And for nonprofits, the impediment is the affiliation rule or to try to prevent one organization from getting loans. It's a horrendous frustration. And every time the subject comes up, I have to deal with it one way or another. Currently, the program ends on June 30th, and it's limited to 501c3 only. Regulatory-wise, I mentioned this earlier, through regulations on April 15th, the administration announced that instead of 5 years, the loans were only 2 years. You can defer the loans only, not pay into the loans for the first 6 months. And there's that 75% of the loan has to be used for payroll in order to get loan forgiveness. That's the state of play now. Next slide, please. You'll see the HEROES Act passed the House by a party line vote about 2 weeks ago. You'll see that they addressed each of those issues that I have flagged here. It's not coincidence. I did that on purpose. It removes the caps for employers of nonprofits all the way up. No 500 cap. It would repeal that affiliation rule, extends to December 31st. They expand it beyond 501c3 to all 501 or 501c organizations. So social welfare and trade unions and chambers of commerce. 5-year maturity, 1 year delay of loans, and then they repeal that payout rule. So I share this because there are clear fault lines. The uh, current law, with the backing of the administration, is the CARES Act approach. And then on the HEROES Act, that's the House answer. And that was the state of play when I first started making these slides. Next slide, please. The next slide shows the HEROES Act, what I just showed you before, and then a legislation that passed the House today, about 2 hours ago, passed the House by a vote of 417 to 1. I don't know who the one is. It's not your guy. Um, this is the bipartisan solution to some of the uh, details of the Paycheck Protection Program. It extends to December 31st, which is what everyone agrees to. This is a Republican and Democrat solution. 5-year maturity, loans can be delayed. When you start repaying the loan isn't based on the calendar, it's based on when the bank gets money from the federal government. The way it works for loan forgiveness is the bank, Adam will explain all this, the bank gets your paperwork, determines how much of the loan is forgiven, can be forgivable. They then send a message to the Treasury saying, pay us, the bank, X amount. If it's 50%, then the nonprofit then starts paying on the 50% that is still a loan. So it's based on reality as opposed to calendar. Seemed like a pretty good solution, and it's one Republicans and Democrats agree to. It also eases the rehiring rules. It codifies a determination. I'm pausing to decide, is this something that Adam should address? But I'll go ahead and this is new. If you don't rehire people, if you had 10 employees before the pandemic and you only have 5 employees, when you're seeking loan forgiveness, 50%, you can only get 50% of your loan forgiven. Gross overstatement. But how about if those 5 employees, you offered reinstatement to them and they all turned you down? In this legislation, those 5, you're given credit if you offered a job that they refused, or if there's a second wave, and when you're seeking forgiveness, the state says you can only that you're shut down, or that you can only operate at 50% of your usual rate. That's a justifiable reason for not hiring somebody on. And there are a couple of other good reasons. So this is a bipartisan solution that gives greater relief to employers, less rigid than originally designed. It changes, instead of repealing the 75-25 rule, that they say that you have to spend at least 40% of your paycheck protection loan on salaries, payroll, and you can spend up to 40% on rent, utilities, mortgage. That's important. There was severe pushback. The administration insisted on a formula, some kind of requirement of paying mostly for payroll, and unions stepped in saying we want more pressure on payroll. So that's why instead of repealing, they came up with that solution. And that was a late yesterday solution that everybody agreed to. And then finally, the borrowers originally in the CARES Act, if you took the Paycheck Protection Program, you cannot take the additional relief of delaying your employer's share of payroll taxes for 2 years. For 2 years. That was if you do one, you can't do the other. Now you can do both. Next slide, please.
David, we have a couple questions, if you don't mind my asking. One, which I think I know the answer to, if you use 100% of the PPP loan for payroll, it's possible to still get 100% forgiveness.
Yes.
Okay.
Assuming you have rehired people and you haven't cut salaries, yes.
Do we have a definition of utility and transportation expense?
Utilities goes, yes, we do. And that's in the late at night, last Friday guidance. And the sheet that you have, that I had on the screen earlier, does explain that utilities does include internet and electric, gas, water, as well as internet and a couple of other items that I'm not remembering. But internet was the one that everyone celebrated.
I think I may have some detail on that further into the slide deck here.
It was
And
in a
lastly,
footnote. It's in the footnote in my paper, and it was in a footnote that I copied from the interim final rule.
okay.
That's spelled out.
And lastly, can rent include home office reimbursements if you're a decentralized organization?
Don't know. I would ask Adam that question.
I would ask Adam that question too. If you have any other
Just the
questions,
warm-up act. He's the main event.
there we go. Any other questions, feel free to chat them in and we will field them as we get them. Otherwise, we'll keep moving forward.
This one I'll be very brief on because you've solved it in Montana. The CARES Act goes out of its way to provide pretty generous unemployment benefits. It waives the waiting period, and the federal government pays the extended 13 weeks. The federal government pays the $600 a week extra on top of normal benefits, and it pays the unemployment benefits for the employees of church employees and smaller employers that never paid into the state and each state's unemployment system. Most employers are held harmless, self-insured. Many nonprofits over a certain number of employees are self-insured. The CARES Act only calls for reimbursement of 50%. The U.S. Department of Labor came out with what we termed in a news release breathtakingly cruel guidance that says nonprofits have to pay 100% of their unemployment benefits up front, and then we'll get reimbursed later. There was confusion. It's very badly written guidance, and we're trying to get it revoked, either legislatively or administratively, but it doesn't matter in Montana because your governor, your administration, your policymakers said nuts to that. We're going to do it right, and y'all are held harmless. And when I was talking to a reporter from San Francisco, I said, check out what they did in Montana. I was talking to a reporter in Maine. Check out what they did in Montana. So you guys are the standard of excellence on this unemployment issue. Thank you. Because I can just say Montana and then move on and they don't ask me any more tough questions. Next slide, please. So stop worrying on that one. I mentioned earlier the coalition ask. I'm going to talk about I have a few more minutes. I'm going to talk about what's going forward in Congress, prognostication and so forth. But let me reiterate these points. We want to improve the Paycheck Protection Program and create a mid-sized loan program. We want unemployment fairness, unemployment insurance fairness for all, not just Montana. We want to increase in giving incentives and increase emergency funding for programs that nonprofits provide. Next slide, please. Giving incentives is a big deal. And I just realized Mountain Time and Montana say the same thing. I just saw that on the time there. On Tuesday, we have a really cool event. Charitable giving incentives, 2017 tax law made it so that fewer people give to charitable nonprofits because the itemized deduction, because fewer people take the itemized deduction, probably only about 8% now. These 6 senators are on the screen there in a quiz. Can people guess who they are? A couple of them are obvious, but they are trying to get a universal deduction so that people who take the standard deduction can get a giving incentive, a tax incentive for donating to you. Currently, the CARES Act for just this year provides $300 of a universal deduction. It's called an above the line deduction. They want to increase that. They want to increase it up to $4,000 a person or $8,000 for a couple or anything they can get. They want to extend it beyond 2020 to 2021 or wherever, because we all know the recession, the pandemic recession isn't going to be over by June 30th or September 30th, and that we nonprofits have taken it very hard and need the funds because everyone's relying on us. Our demand is up. This event, there's 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats from across the political spectrum. That's Mike Lee, lower left corner from Utah. That's Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota. They're in the middle of the top row. Several others, Republicans and Democrats, are all coming together. It's a call that we're doing on Tuesday at 3 o'clock Mountain Time. this is a dog bites man story. We don't get 6 senators on a call. We don't get 6 senators agreeing on a time to talk, much less agreeing on a major policy change. The goal of this is to rally the whole nonprofit community behind this effort that can happen when we're all unified. You're blessed in Montana. You have a Republican and a Democratic senator. That's a different dynamic than Oregon that has 2 Democratic senators, or South Carolina that has 2 Republican senators. So it'll be interesting to hear how the different sides talk, because their perspective is how you could communicate with your senators. So this is a big deal. I hope that you were registered. We only have 10,000 slots, and I'm hitting refresh to see we're now at 1,500. So, operator standing by. Please join the call now, or please sign up for it. Next slide, please. That was the advertisement for the presentation. The HEROES Act that I've already mentioned, it passed the House. It was a partisan vote. Big picture items there were $1 trillion for state and local governments, a second round of checks to taxpayers, and resources for social support programs. Next slide. I've already explained some of this other stuff. This Paycheck Protection improvement, and then they actually did some good work today on Paycheck Protection. We also want to create a mid-sized loan program so that nonprofits up to 10,000 employees can get forgivable loans. Also, technical corrections on the unemployment insurance. But still undone is the big item down there below, charitable giving incentive. That's why we're having the big event on Tuesday. Next slide. This is my guessing of where things are going to go. The House majority view is the HEROES Act. That's their answer. It's a $3 trillion bill. Senate majority has been less eager to act. Senator McConnell, the Senate majority leader, has said we want to take a wait and see approach. Maybe July, maybe August or September we'll enact new legislation. For nonprofits, that's not an acceptable answer, because except in Montana, there are unemployment bills that are coming due. Mid-sized nonprofits don't have any relief yet. So the nonprofits with 600 employees haven't gotten any support. They're on their own. Charitable giving hasn't happened. People aren't giving. We need new incentives to increase giving, and donations delayed or donations denied when you need it right now to get the work done. So the idea is wait and see doesn't work for nonprofits, and you'll be hearing us ramping up ramping up the activities in this area to build pressure on Congress to pass responsible, important, needed legislation. That event Tuesday is part of that effort. There's a view that governments don't need the funds because they appropriated $150 billion and the states haven't used that money yet. Many states are saying the strings attached to it are so strict that we can't spend the money the way Congress intended. That needs to be loosened. There's some bills to try to loosen that up. The House Democratic view is that that $1 trillion is needed to help the states survive. Fiscal years start on July 1st in most states, so a wait and see means that states are going to be hitting that wall by the 1st of July. So that's greater time pressure. And then liability protections. There's the concern that, I'm going to quote Liz Moore. Liz, a warning, I'm going to quote you again. There's a concern that if we reopen, we could be sued. That's the business community has been expressing this. The Republican leadership in the House is strongly in agreement with that point of view. U.S. Chamber of Commerce is working on legislation. And usual fault lines in Washington is if the U.S. Chamber of Commerce says they want something, then the unions and the trial lawyers say no, no, no. The parties kind of line up along the same line. So saying liability reform is like saying until you give us what we want, we're not going to legislate type of thing. I'm giving you the stereotypical political rhetoric, not the substance. At the substantive level, many nonprofits are starting to say, well, if we do everything we can do, we do all the cleaning, we follow all the protocols, could we still be sued as well? So there's nonprofits as employers and nonprofits as public facing entities are asking the same sorts of questions of how do we reopen safely? So more nonprofits are starting to say that liability relief makes sense to us. Quoting Liz Moore in an earlier issue, you've heard us talk about the overtime issue. On that issue, Liz said everybody in our network, if you remember our map with all the logos, everyone on our network has quoted Liz Moore saying this. On these issues involving employees, we nonprofits tend to have moral support and operational anxiety. We care about people, we care about our operations and bottom line, and it's okay. We see both sides of an issue. My thought is that on the liability issue, nonprofits are in the best position to find and identify and champion a solution. I don't have the solution today. As you have ideas and suggestions, I encourage you to share, because the nonprofit community is in the position. All the other issues I've talked about are bipartisan. This is an issue that's extremely partisan, but it affects us, and I think we're in a position to lead Congress through the morass, through the trench warfare, into getting something done. So liability protection is something that's going to need to be resolved, and we're looking for good ideas. Our network, our policy committee, I presume, will be digging into it. The chair of my policy committee is that second box over there on the screen, if you have Liz showing there. So we will be digging into that area. I typed these slides up before the vote today, that they passed the PPP partial fixes by 417 to 1. So the pressure on the Paycheck Protection Program will be relieved when the Senate takes it up. I don't have a guarantee or even insights yet as to when the Senate, if the Senate will take up the House passed bill from earlier today. I think it will, and I think that the 8-week deadline for most of you will be extended to 24 weeks, and you'll have more flexibility for how you spend the money in terms of payroll versus non-payroll, and when you need to bring people back. So that's that. Next slide, please. Look at there, I got all the way through it, mostly in time.
Thanks, David.
Questions, or
we have a couple questions in the chat, and then others, if you have a question for David, please type it in and we will make sure we ask it. One question which I think I will cover in my section later, but increases in staff wages or bonuses paid to employees, are those considered part of payroll costs? Forgivable payroll.
I haven't seen anything on increased salaries. I can make some guesses, but bonuses, absolutely. And hazard pay, absolutely. Those are expressly included in the definition of what is acceptable, what is appropriate.
We have another pretty specific question. If we have one member who says we pay into our retirement plan once a year, and that happens to fall in the 8-week period of the PPP loan forgiveness calculation for payroll expense. The payments for the 2019 plan year, if that matters, can that retirement plan payment be included in the calculation for loan forgiveness?
My question is it just the 8 weeks, or is it for the whole year? I'm curious what Adam would say. Something they do make clear, not this question, but other things, if you have payments for, if you have 2 regular monthly bills payments due, you can count those, and you can do a pro rata share of the rest of during your covered period. Although covered period just expanded, so I don't know how that works yet. The interim final rule that came out last Friday is based on 8 weeks. If Congress changes 8 weeks to 24 weeks by Monday or Tuesday, all of that changes. Just realize that. Adam, what would you say about the pension?
The only guidance I would give, which is definitely not written in stone, is I would guess that whatever portion of that retirement benefit that was paid to the employee within that 8-week period. So even though you paid the retirement plan service for the year, you're offering those benefits to your employees on a paycheck by paycheck basis. So my guess is that portion that falls in line with your payroll schedule will be the portion that you can calculate for loan forgiveness. But that's just my guess.
The bad news is you can't count the whole year in the period.
Correct.
Good news is you can count the 8 weeks or the 24 weeks.
Yes. Yes.
Depending on when timing. You can include it as part of your costs. And those are payroll costs.
Mhm. Another question. Does the current constellation of the Supreme Court give us any indication of how the liability protection question will go if litigation gets all the way to the Supremes?
That's an area where they have not tipped their hand, I don't think. There are a lot of issues that are much more conservative, a lot of issues that are a crapshoot as to whether longstanding law is going to change. Liability, I haven't seen changes yet. I would presume the Supreme Court, if it's a objective looking decision, they would lean pro-employer, but I haven't seen cases building up to this that would give them a clear sign.
So when folks filled out their PPP loans, they had to certify that they were suffering economic uncertainty. Is there a definition yet of what that means? And our funding has not been at risk through this, and we're not clear if we would be eligible to apply for the PPP.
I'd like to. There's clarity that if you borrowed less than $2 million, they don't care.
Yeah.
There's a lot of rhetoric in the area. There's been no legislative fixes in this area, and the attention is all focused on the dispute over Planned Parenthood in the last week or so. I don't, other than the $2 million threshold, I don't think there's been much more clarity about necessity.
Correct. Okay.
This is an issue that's been of great concern to nonprofits, because what if you have 2 months operating reserves? Okay, 3 months. What if you have a year operating reserves? At what point is that considered too liquid? Yeah. It hasn't come up there except for one think tank here in DC that supposedly had $115 million in an endowment. They gave the money back and stopped the attention. This is an issue of great concern. Everyone's afraid to bring it up out loud because we're afraid we might get the wrong answer. But if you have reserves of X, how much is too much? If your loan is less than $2 million, it doesn't matter.
Any other questions for David? Thank you, David, so much for being here and for all you're doing. I'm going to wait another minute or so to see if we get any other questions in the chat. Not seeing any come in.
Okay. Off the hook, good.
Off the hook.
Liz Moore and I both, neither Liz nor I are accountants. And
that's such an understatement.
You forced me to act like one on camera today. But,
David, thank you so much. And you may have some things to add as Adam speaks. It was funny because just as you said, what would Adam say? I typed in, what would Adam say? We've been working together too long.
Yep. So I'm going to take it from here.
Adam, the main event.
There you go, the main event, yeah. So I'm going to talk a bit more mechanically about the PPP loan process and actually go through verse by verse, I guess, what the application form says and what the interim guidance that came out last Friday says about the process. Knowing, as David said, that this process was released last Friday before a 3-day weekend at 10:44 Eastern time. So we haven't had a lot of time to look at it, A. And B, everything that I'm about to say may change. And it may change quickly and it may change after a few weeks. It seems like if it's going to change, the lane is going to get wider. The regulations are going to be lessened, and forgiveness is going to be easier, or the amount of time in which you have to spend the PPP loan is going to be broadened. So I would say that the current process that was outlined today is probably most valid For those organizations that are certain at this point in time that they're 100% going to be forgiven on their loan, and they can go through that process and be done with it. If you're not in that place, or you still have some uncertainty around how you've spent the funds, or need to spend the funds, or need to rehire people, if there's still any uncertainty in your situation, my guidance is to hold pat and see what happens here with pending legislation, which should make things easier as we move into the future. So big picture, just to the foundation, like David said, the forgiveness process is done through your lender. So you took out the PPP loan through your local bank, and you will give your forgiveness application to them. So my first bit of guidance is to reach out to your local lender and see what their process is for actually filing the forgiveness application. The SBA has posted the application. You'll have to do that application, but certain lenders are going to ask for different bits of documentation to support that application than others. And they're going to have a process for walking you through that. Some smaller banks may just be, email it over and we'll take it. Some bigger banks like Bank of America or Wells Fargo or US Bank may have a more formalized online process for this. So my first bit of guidance is find out what your lender is recommending for a process. Your lender is the one who takes your application, reviews everything, and makes a decision regarding the forgiveness amount. They give that decision to the SBA, and the SBA has the lender has 60 days to give that decision to the SBA. The SBA then has 90 days to respond back to the lender saying, yeah, we agree, or we want to do a review, or we see some issues and we want to dig further in. The lender will then notify the borrower of the SBA decision. So you submit to your lender, the lender goes and gets the answer from the SBA and then lets you know once they've heard that. As David said, I'm going to back up one slide. As David said, the big question that folks had was whether or not your certification of need, I guess, which you signed when you did your PPP loan, what that meant, whether or not you actually needed the funds or not. And is the SBA going to come back and say, well, you really didn't need those, and therefore we're not forgiving your loan? The SBA has said that if your loan was under $2 million, they're considering it made in good faith, meaning they're not going to question your certification of need. If it's above $2 million, they said they're probably going to do a review or an audit, but there's not any kind of guidance or definition of what they consider need to be. So that's still an unanswered question at this point in time. I also want to note that while your lender is responsible for processing and evaluating your forgiveness application, they are not responsible for guaranteeing that the information that you have on there is accurate, nor are they liable if there are any mistakes that are made in the calculation of payroll, non-payroll, or FTE, or the things that we're going to talk about here. So there's actually written into the interim rule, you can read the bolded underlined portion here. They're expected to perform a good faith review in a reasonable time of the calculations that you give them in your application. And if they find errors, they should work with you to remedy those issues. But they are not the one at the end of the day that's on the hook. If there are mistakes that are made, and the SBA can come back and review your application for forgiveness and say, this was calculated incorrectly or whatever it might be. So just know that, and I say that because I've heard talk from a few different lenders, some of which have said, we're going to work with our people and we're going to make sure that we're going to kind of hold their hand, and we're okay walking down that process with them to make sure the information is accurate, even though we're not responsible for that. I've heard other lenders say, we are just going to make sure that all the information is on the application and that it's complete. And we're going to do a bit of a good faith check to make sure it's accurate based off of what we know, but we're not going to really dive in and help with that consultation and the technical assistance, because we don't want to be liable at the end of the day if the borrower has a mistake and gets reviewed by the SBA. So just know that your lender will work with you, but they're not the ones that are ultimately responsible for the information that's put in the application. Like I said before, the SBA can review any loan at any time, although they have stated that those loans under $2 million will be considered made in good faith from the certification of need standpoint. They may still review it for other areas, but we're talking hundreds of thousands of PPP loans, and they do not have the capacity to review a lot. So you're probably okay in that regard, but they can review any loan at any time. You are required to keep all your documentation for your PPP loan, both when you made the loan and when you applied for forgiveness. Keep all of that documentation for up to 6 years. And the SBA can come in at any point in the next 6 years and say, we want to see your PPP loan documentation or your forgiveness documentation, and you need to be able to produce it. So the application itself consists of 3 documents which are part of a packet. One is the actual forgiveness calculation form, which is the official form that has all the information on it and also has certifications from you that you attest to the accuracy of the information, and you know that you have to keep the documentation for 6 years, and you know the SBA can review it at any time and all that legalese. There's also a Schedule A that helps you calculate payroll and your full-time equivalent or number of full-time employees, and any numbers that you need to calculate for whether or not you need to reduce your forgiveness from the full amount. There's also a worksheet to the schedule. So there's the application, a schedule, and a worksheet that has similar calculations as well. I think we have the application on our website. If we don't, we will get it up there as soon as we can. But again, I would advise you to start first by going to your lender. They can send you the application or give you the link to that. And we'll also give you what additional documentation they want from you to process that application, because that may differ depending on your lender. So what could ultimately impact your forgiveness and not allow you to get the 100% forgivable loan? The first right now is that 75-25 rule. Right now you have to spend at least 75% of the PPP funds on payroll costs. And we're going to talk about what's defined as payroll, and no more than 25% on non-payroll costs. And there's a definition of what those can be. As we heard from David, that rule may change and may go down to 60-40, which provides you more latitude if you have less payroll and more non-payroll costs to get all of that forgiven. Also, what could impact your forgiveness is if you hired back fewer employees than you had before COVID-19 happened. And if you don't anticipate hiring them back by the end of the loan period, which right now is at June 30, that could impact your forgiveness. Also, if you pay your employees less per employee than you did before pre-COVID, and there are some guidance on that, which we'll go into. And lastly, if you took out an economic injury disaster loan, the cash advance, which was basically a grant that you didn't have to pay back, and it was up to $10,000. Some people got 10, some people got 1, some people got anywhere in between there, with a maximum of $10,000. If you received that advance but then didn't do a full EIDL loan, which we would have to pay back anyway, if you just got the advance, that advance amount is going to be subtracted from your PPP loan, the forgivable amount of your PPP loan. So if you got a $10,000 advance and then a $70,000 PPP loan, only $60,000 of the PPP loan is going to be forgiven. So you keep the 10, 60 of the PPP is forgiven, but you still have a $10,000 amount that is not forgivable. So your steps in the application, which it's pretty straightforward. Once you have the application, you can walk through it pretty easily between that and then the interim rules, which we also have posted on our website, which have very clear guidance, I think, on sort of question by question, item by item, how to make some of these calculations and definitions. First of all, you calculate your payroll costs, then you calculate your non-payroll costs, then you make an adjustment based off of your number of full-time employees currently versus the pre-COVID reference period. Then you make a second adjustment to that based off of any reductions that you had because of less compensation per employee compared to that reference period. And then you subtract out that EIDL advance, if you have that, from what's ultimately forgiven for you on the loan. So the first step, calculating payroll costs. You have, as of right now, you calculate payroll for 8 weeks from either the date of disbursement, or the first day of your new payroll cycle after that disbursement happened. So you have some grace to not try to calculate the exact amount of compensation from the date of disbursement when you receive the money. You can move to the next pay period and go 8 weeks or 56 days from that point in time. Right now it's at 8 weeks. As you've heard, it may move to 24 weeks or may move to the end of the year. So this is in flux right now. Payroll includes wages, benefits, commissions, bonuses, hazard pay. It's a broad definition of compensation, but it only includes compensation that is below $100,000 annualized per employee. So if someone makes annually more than $100,000, only the first $100,000 of their total compensation is considered forgivable in this regard. And you would use Schedule A, the Schedule A worksheet, to actually list your employees, list the amount of compensation, and so there's some other questions there around their payroll status. So you can either use that worksheet, or you can submit just the exact same report that's pulled from your payroll system if you have more than 5 or 6 employees, because it only gives you enough lines for a handful of employees. So if you have 50 employees or 100 employees, it's going to be easier to pull this information from your payroll reports, whether that's QuickBooks or ADP or whatever that your system might be. You can submit that instead of the schedule worksheet. On non-payroll costs, the definition of this right now is for electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, or internet access for which services began before February 15th. So if you just got internet or just got some utility costs in April because you knew, hey, this might get paid for by the PPP, you had to begin service before February 15th. So you can't add new services and expect that to get paid. Those eligible expenses are either paid during the covered period, which is that 8-week period, either from the date of disbursement or from the start of the next payroll period. So paid during the covered period or incurred during the covered period and paid on or before the next regular billing date, even if the billing date is after the covered period. So if you read the interim final rule on this actually gives you a little more latitude to cover some maybe extra payroll or extra non-payroll costs than you would expect. First, so as an example, if you got the loan on April 15th and you could pay your March utility bill on April 16th, and then at the back end of the loan, you're not going to pay your June utility bill until July, which is after the 8-week period. You could actually use both of those. So you actually have both of those covered as covered expenses for the PPP. So either paid during the 8 weeks or incurred during the 8 weeks and paid after. And you can use both of those definitions here. The reason that I think they allowed that is because they still have this 25% cap on the total loan amount. So you can't pile a whole bunch of utility expense into that 8-week period because at a maximum, it can only be up to 25% of your total loan amount. So that caps the amount obviously the amount of expense that can be covered there. Again, that 25% may change, as might the covered period from 8 weeks to 24 weeks. So wait and see on what might happen there. I guess before I move on to any adjustments to forgiveness, so that's going to get you what the sort of the starting maximum amount of cost that you can hope to get forgiven at the end of this. And there's some adjustments that are going to reduce that, but that's the maximum. Those two things, calculating payroll and non-payroll. Are there any questions in the chat? I guess Shelby, if you could bring those in if there are any.
Adam, we had one question earlier that said if we did not let staff go, so did not rehire, but kept our staff due to PPP, is the loan still forgivable?
Yes, and that's this adjustment that we're going to talk about right here, where basically if you've kept the same amount of staff as you had before the COVID-19, you're going to be fine. Even if you let go of staff and then rehire the same amount, you're going to be fine. It's just when you laid off staff and then hired back fewer, that you may run into challenges in regards to the amount that will be forgiven.
Okay. Shelby, do you want to do the chat or do you want me to?
I was just looking at it right now. You know, it looks like several of these questions you answered, Adam, but I don't know if you touched on if you're a semi-monthly payer, have they put a way to calculate the 8 weeks if they are 1 through 15 and then 16 through the end of the month?
Say that again, Shelby, sorry.
Essentially, if you're a semi-monthly, you have a semi-monthly payroll, is there a way to calculate those 8 weeks?
So you would start from you would either start from the exact date of disbursement and count out 8 weeks, exactly 56 days, or you can start when the next payroll period starts and then just look out 8 weeks from there. So that 8 weeks may end before that last pay period is fully up, but you would just calculate 8 weeks worth of payroll and then end it at that point. So for you, if you're doing 2 a month, that's going to be basically 2 months worth of payroll, or whatever. It's the beginning pay period or the end pay period is probably not going to be a full pay period that's getting calculated. So you would go out just exactly 8 weeks, exactly 56 days.
Perfect. I think that's a great point. And I can't remember if you touched on this, but is workers' compensation insurance premium considered a payroll cost?
I do not believe so, but I do not know.
Mike,
what would David say?
What would David say? Mike Oberg had that question, and we will we'll say tentatively we don't know and look for some follow-up.
Yep.
Saw that question earlier, and I'm just looking at the regulations, the interim final rule. They don't say anything about workers' compensation. They do say on payroll, on the weekly, biweekly, they say the question was semi-monthly. They say biweekly or more frequent. I think if you pay on the 15th and the 30th, it doesn't work. But if you pay every 2 weeks, it does. That's a 1 day difference that really shouldn't matter. But they make a point several times of saying biweekly or more frequent.
Right.
Interesting. And then Adam, do you have any resources in terms of defining transportation costs? We had a couple just basic questions on defining it, and then whether or not reimbursed mileage counts for transportation.
I believe reimbursed mileage does, but I do not have a resource in front of me. And I don't think the interim rule actually speaks to a definition of transportation costs, but we can do some research and we'll post it online or send it out with post
Perfect.
town hall.
And we'll have another town hall on Tuesday to dig into some of this. So if you have unanswered questions from today, please we'll have some time to research and get back to you if by next Tuesday, if not before.
Okay.
And then I think you mentioned this as well, but just to clarify, do you calculate payroll cost based on gross pay or net pay?
Gross.
Okay.
Yeah, gross, but you can include state taxes, but you can't include federal taxes in the calculation. I'm pretty certain on that. But yeah, you can include state and local taxes, but you can't include Fed taxes in calculating payroll.
Adam, did lenders pull federal taxes out before they did the distributions?
Yes, I believe it was part of that calculation. When you're calculating your maximum loan amount, that exactly, the federal taxes were not included.
Great. And there's a question on variable employees, and we've had this come up a few times. So if you have a variable employee that works somewhere between 3 to 7 hours a week or less than 0.5 FTE, how do you count those in terms of FTEs?
Yeah, that's a good segue into this slide I have up right here, I think. So I'll move forward. I think I should answer that with these next couple slides.
Perfect.
So after you've calculated that maximum amount that you can hope to be forgiven by calculating your payroll cost and non-payroll, you have to make adjustments based off of the number of full-time employees that you have, full-time equivalent employees that you have, and the amount of compensation per employee that you're providing them compared to the reference period or a reference period at pre-COVID. So if your average number of FTE employees during the covered period, which is either data disbursement or 8 weeks from this next pay period, is less than the reference period, you have some different options on figuring out what that reference period is. The total eligible expenses available for forgiveness is reduced proportionally by the percentage reduction in FTE employees. So if you had 8 employees in the reference period, and you're 8 full-time equivalent employees in the reference period, and you're only able to hire back 4 for the covered period, that's 4/8, one half of those employees. Immediately, your forgivable amount is going to be reduced by half, with some exceptions, which I will get into. But that's the principle, at least. We know what the covered period is. The reference period, you have some options. So you can either look back to basically this time last year, February 15th through June 30th of last year. You can look to the first 2 months of this year, January 1st through February 29th. Or if you're a seasonal employer, and your headcount fluctuates in the summer more than it would in those first couple months of the year, you can pick any 12-week period between May 1st and September 15th of 2019 to capture what an average number of full-time equivalent employees you would have. And basically, when you pick your reference period, you want to pick the period that is most accurate to your present situation. And frankly, you probably want to pick the period that has the lowest number of average full-time equivalent employees. If you have part-time employees, you can either calculate their exact status. So if they work half-time, it can be 0.5, or 3/4 time, 0.75. If they're a variable employee, or if you don't calculate what their actual fixed status is, the SBA will allow you to use 0.5 as a default. So for those variable employees, if they only work 3 to 7 hours a week, you can either pick an amount there and set it at, it would be like 0.2 or 0.15, or the SBA will let you use 0.5, which is half-time, as a default for those employees. As long as you're consistent in those calculations for both the covered period and the reference period. And you would use this Schedule A worksheet to calculate the FTE, your total number of FTEs both during the covered period and the reference period, and make any adjustments to your forgiveness based off of what those numbers tell you. You have some exceptions to this, though. There are some exemptions, I guess, that allow you to not reduce your forgivable amount if you have fewer employees now than you did pre-COVID. The first is if you are able to rehire your employees by June 30th. So if you laid them off between February 15th and April 26th, and you're able to rehire them by the end of June, you don't have to calculate them as a less FTE in your calculation. If you have made a good faith offer to rehire them and they have turned you down, and you have a written offer to them and a written rejection offer from them saying, I'm not going to take the job, you're not penalized for that. As long as you inform your state unemployment office within 30 days of the rejection, which is going to trigger some action on the unemployment office for their unemployment benefits. And thirdly, if you fired an employee for cause, or they voluntarily resigned, or requested a reduced scheduling during the covered period, you're not penalized for that reduction in FTE based off of actions that were outside of your control. So this is called safe harbor. You have some safe harbor provisions that protect you from being penalized for some actions that are either outside of your control, or if you plan on rectifying those by the end of June, which again, that number that date may change depending on what happens with current legislation that may get pushed out to December 31st. So wait and see on that. After you've made that adjustment for the number of employees you have working for you, you also have to make an adjustment for the amount of compensation per employee that you're offering to those employees. So your forgiveness will be reduced dollar for dollar for any amount of compensation less than 75% of what those employees made pre-COVID-19. So an example, let's say that I had an employee who made $100,000, and when I brought them back, I paid them for the same amount of work, same number of hours, I paid them $60,000. Now I have some grace there. I have some latitude. It's up to 25%. So I can pay them anywhere from 75 to 100 grand and be okay. But anything below 75 grand, I'm going to be penalized dollar for dollar on whatever that amount is. So if I paid them 60, 75 minus 60 is 15,000. I would have $15,000 subtracted from my forgivable amount for that employee. And this is done on an employee level, employee basis, based off of what their compensation was during the reference period. And again, you have those, in this instance, your reference period is January 1st through March 31st of 2020. So what they were making immediately before COVID-19. Again, you have some similar exceptions here. Any reduction, so you will not be penalized for these reductions in salary if you restore the salary before June 30th, which again may get pushed out depending on what current legislation says. Also, you're not going to be, you're not going to have a penalty, a double penalty, I guess, if you reduce wages due to reduced hours, which would be reduced headcount, right? So that's not going to impact you twice. So if you reduce an employee's hours, you're going to feel that on the FTE side, but you're not going to have to calculate that reduction on the amount of compensation side. So it's only going to be taken out once. And again, you would use the Schedule A worksheet. So basically, you're providing documentation of what your employees made before this during the reference period, what they're making now, how many of them you have now, and what their payroll status is with the worksheet or with your payroll reports that you're able to give to your lender. After you've done those steps, so you've calculated your total eligible cost, you've made reductions for FTE, you've made reductions for compensation. The last reduction, which you actually don't put on the application, but it's for that idle advance. So you would actually then put your loan, your forgivable amount that you're asking to be forgiven on the bottom line, the total line of the application. But you need to know that when the SBA gets it, they're going to take out the idle advanced amount from what they actually decide to forgive. So just know, even though you're not putting that on the line, that's going to come out when the SBA renders their decision back to your lender, who communicates that to you. So if you did take out an advance up to $10,000, that amount is going to be deducted. That's the process. And again, I'm advising you right now, if you feel like, if you use 100% of this loan for payroll and you've used it all and you've kept your staff whole, both in the number of employees you have and in the amount of compensation you're providing them, and you think forgiveness is just kind of a slam dunk case, reach out to your lender and learn what that process is from their perspective, and you can get it done. If you have questions, or if you're uncertain, or if you haven't spent all the PPP funding, or you've had to rehire people or have been slow in rehiring people, or any of those other circumstances that we've talked about, I'm advising maybe you can talk to your lender, but maybe just hold off until we see what actually pans out with current legislation that may broaden the road a little bit and make it easier to achieve a higher level of forgiveness on your PPP loan. I think that was what we had. Any questions?
Adam, there are some questions in the chat.
Okay.
Confirm that Montana state taxes are part of the allowable costs.
Okay.
Is that correct?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Okay. Shelby, do you want to do these?
Yeah, I think some of them we may need to do some investigating on, but we'll go ahead and take some. So Heather asked, we received an advance on the idle, but we are also getting the full idle loan in process at this moment. We are getting full loan. Can we have to use that advancement towards the PPP?
I think they're in the application. I think there's actually language that says, which did you take out an idle advance without taking out a full 7A or idle loan. I think if you're taking out the full idle loan, that's going to be done again through a lender. and I would communicate with your lender around how that's going to function, because I think some of those were actually the full idle loan was kind of rolled into a PPP, and others it was kept distinct and it was kept as a separate vehicle. So I think talk to your lender and see how you should handle that. If you did take out the full loan, it's probably not going to be deducted off of your PPP. So you probably should be okay on that, but communicate with your lender.
Perfect. Does the employer's health insurance premium that the employer pays count towards the employee's $100,000 annual salary cap?
I had the answer to this. I think compensation is, I think it's $100,000 in wages and salary, but you can go above the $100,000 for benefits, for non-cash compensation.
Stephanie will double check that. But
we will double check that. I feel pretty confident in that, but we'll double check. I know I've seen the answer to that. I just can't remember what it is off the top of my head.
This is from Rachel. It's 2 questions. So Adam, I'm going to still read it out loud, but it might be helpful if you are able to read it as well.
Okay.
Rachel Garwin, are you double penalized for both an FTE reduction and salary reduction for the same employees? For example, if someone is working 60%, they are working less hours and making less money as a result. Do you have to reduce forgiveness by both the FTE calculation and the money for salary reduction?
Yep. So this, I tried to mention this. No, you're not penalized twice. So if they are making less money because they're working fewer hours, that comes out in your FTE calculation, and you don't have to have a reduction on the compensation side because they're still making the same amount hourly as they would have before. So technically their salary or their compensation is still the same. They're just working fewer hours. So you would feel that on the FTE calculation, not on the compensation side.
Perfect. And this will probably be a lender question as well, but what happens if you've received the EIDL advance but are still waiting on the SBA for the rest of the EIDL process?
Yeah, question for the lender to see what's happening in that regard. And I think, again, on the application, I think it actually asked you for a case number or some sort of identifying number for your EIDL, which should trigger on the SBA just where that whole thing is in process.
Okay. And I can't remember if you answered this. When you say state taxes, are you talking state withholding taxes or state unemployment?
I was talking state withholding, and I don't have the answer on unemployment. I think it's just the only thing that I've seen that it's not part of the payroll cost is federal taxes. So I can look specifically to state unemployment.
Unemployment taxes are part of payroll.
Are part of payroll. Okay.
So
Thank you, David.
To clarify, unemployment, state
And withholding.
And withholding are part of allowable.
Yes.
And I don't, this one might need, let's see. We deposit matching 3% into employees' IRAs at the end of the year. Can we count it for the 56 days, even if it is not actually deposited until the end of the year? I'm guessing there's a contribution, and the question is whether that will be forgiven if it's not deposited until December.
Yep. There's I think it is, because it is a cost incurred. And there's some guidance in the interim rule about when payroll costs are actually incurred. It's not just when it's paid, but it's actually when it's incurred. And you're incurring 56 days worth of retirement expense as an organization, even though you're actually not depositing the funds until the end of the year. So I can find guidance on that, but I am fairly certain that it's covered as part of payroll cost.
But just for those 56 days?
Just for the 56 days worth, correct? Not for the whole year. And that 56 days may expand, even though your PPP amount isn't going to get larger, but the time frame may expand.
Adam, I just want to check in. Do you have capacity for a couple more questions?
I do, yes.
All right.
Hold on, Shelby. I think David is going to take off. And so, David, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Had a good time.
Great. Thanks. Okay.
Great. And I'm reading this as I'm saying it. So most of our caregiver employees have continued through the past few months as essential workers. They do have a public transportation department that was essentially shut down when people had to stop going into the community. A couple of them have worked a few hours here and there during the shutdown. They have drawn unemployment insurance for the hours reduced. How do we account for this scenario?
So Anna, you're asking how you would calculate their payroll for forgiveness, for PPP forgiveness. If that's the case, yes. So you're going to have to calculate what their status, what their employee status is, which at a minimum you can use 0.5, even though that's sort of the default. So if you have them on your payroll, even if they've only worked a few hours a week, you can count them as a 0.5 FTE. And you need to compare that to the reference period before this. Probably the harder part is actually documenting that you've paid the costs that can go for the PPP loan if they're not working the number of hours that they were before. And that's why I think there's a number of employers who've been in that exact same circumstance where they've received the money, but they haven't had enough work to actually pay the employees the amount of money that they need to in 8 weeks to get their full loan forgiven. And that's why there's talk of expanding that period, which gives you more time to pay out those funds to your employees as payroll to have that forgiven. So I think you calculated the exact same way as we just talked about, where you would calculate the amount of money that you've paid to them in payroll in the last 8 weeks, and what their FTE status is, and what their compensation is compared to what it was prior. But I would argue that you should probably hold fast until you find out what's going to happen with some of these revisions to the PPP program.
Thank you. And then do we pull out employers' health insurance premiums and retirement contributions for an employee with an annual salary in excess of $100,000?
I don't think you have to. I think it's just the amount of salary up to $100,000. But I think for the benefits above and beyond that, you can calculate those still. But again, that's one of those questions that I know I've seen the answer to it. I just can't remember off the top of my head what it is.
And you know, I think your gut is probably correct there, Adam, because you're not even pulling out the entire employee. You're just pulling out the excess.
Correct.
Over 100.
Correct.
So I imagine health insurance premiums and all of that will fit in there.
Yep.
Does anyone that's still on the line have, I think we've made it through most of these, but does anyone have a question that is still unanswered, even if you've asked it and need a little clarification? Please feel free to type it in below, and then we will as well take a closer look at some of these questions and aim to have answers by next Tuesday at the latest, if not before.
We'll probably, if we don't put them into the sort of post town hall email, we'll put them on our PPP FAQ page, which we're going to update that. And we're also going to have linked there the interim final rule that came out last Friday. And there's that one, and there's also one for lenders, which explains more of the process from the lender side, but it's helpful for us too in regards to the forgiveness process. So those are good documents for answering some of these questions, because it gives some definitions of utilities and gives some answers to other questions. So seek those out if you have specific questions that we aren't able to answer.
All right, I think that's it on the questions, and we will take the recording. We're going to go ahead and upload it and email it out this afternoon, and it'll also be posted on our town hall page. I'm going to send you the link to that right now. And we will also take Adam's and David's slide decks and have those available.
Yep.
Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll continue to bring current news either through our e-news or through the town halls as things change. Hopefully not quite as rapidly as they have been, but as you can see, you know, David updated his slides, you know, kind of minutes before the presentation, because things do tend to change very quickly. So Thank you so much, Adam, as well, for your preciseness around those questions. I think those are the things everybody's thinking about, is the little tiny details.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
what did Adam say? It's a
What
great.
did Adam say? Thank you all for being here, and reach out with any questions, or if you need to talk through your own circumstance, send us an email, and happy to do that.
All right. Thank you much.